Hi everybody, my name is Jeffrey Way, and in today's lesson of PHP Fundamentals, I'd like to talk just a little bit about objects, at least on a low level. So I'm going to switch over to CodeRunner, and before we dig in, it's important for me to explain that objects are actually something that can be a little bit confusing. You're going to have to learn about classes, and that's something that we're not yet ready for. We'll take a look at that toward the end of the course. But nonetheless, I still want you to have a basic understanding of the idea of an object. So we know that we could create an associative array to contain information about something. It can be one item, an object. So, for example, we could have a person, and that would be an associative array, and this person would have a first name, right? Well, we will set that to John, and the person could have a last name. Notice that we are defining characteristics of this object or this person, John Doe, and John Doe probably has a job, so we could say job, and maybe he's a teacher, and that's fine for now. So if we wanted to view information about this array, we could do print r, or we could do var dump, and then if I var dump the person, sure enough, we get an array of 3 items. Okay, this is something we're very familiar with at this point. But sometimes when you're working with information like this, it makes more sense for it to be part of an object. Because if you think about it, we have this person, and this is a unique person, but all people will share similar characteristics. All people will have a first name. All people will have some kind of job or place in the world. All people will have a number of limbs. One person maybe has one limb. One person has 2 limbs. One person's name is John. Another person's name is Joe. So they all stem from the same tree, so to speak, but each of them is unique. And this is how we can think of objects or class instances. So as I noted, we're not going to cover classes, but I do want to give you the 2-minute crash course on what a class would look like. So consider this. If we were to take that array and represent it as a class, we would have class person. And the best way that you can think of a class is as a blueprint. What would be the blueprint for a person? What characteristics do all people share? Well, all people would share a name. So we'll have an option for that. This blueprint will define a name. What else would a person blueprint? Well, each person will probably have some job or school or some responsibility in the world. Okay, but in addition to characteristics, each person can do things. And when you think of verbs, you think of methods. Do something. Well, that is a method. So for example, we're not really working with real code here. We're using real world comparisons, but this is fairly common when you're first trying to understand the idea of a class and an instance. So all people, we hope, should be able to speak, or better yet, all people should be able to communicate. Some people need to use sign language, but some people can use their mouths, of course. So we could have a function, or a function that is within a class. It's actually the same thing, but we refer to it as a method. So think of this as the verb. So public function communicate. And this represents an action, communicate. And then within here, you would write the necessary code to execute that. Again, one person may have to use sign language, one person could use some kind of alien communication, and people like us would use our mouths. So in this case, we're simply going to return communicating with the understanding that that represents some level of code that represents the act of communicating. So notice at this point, it's very simple, it's not fleshed out, but we have defined the blueprint for what a person is and should be able to do. And of course, it's missing lots of stuff, but you get the idea. So now, once we have the blueprint, we could have specific instances or objects. So think about it, one person's name is Joe, one person might be black, one person might be white, one person, like us, would be developers, another person will be in marketing or teaching. But that said, they all share the same characteristics. This is the blueprint. This is our class. Now, to create a new instance of it, we'll create new person, and we'll say P for person. But now we need to be able to give it information. So notice that we have these public name and job. This is what we call properties. So once again, I don't expect you to follow all of this. Just watch for now. We're going to have this special function that will run as soon as we create this new instance or new object. And this new person will accept parameters for name and job. And I'm going to go ahead and pass that in, John, and John is a teacher. And then we're going to set these properties on the instance. So now I can say this name. This is going to refer to the instance equals name. And then I'm going to do one more for the job. So if you're just learning this, this should be very confusing to you. And if it is, good, you're on the right track. This should be very confusing. I just want to give you a high-level overview of it before we dig into objects. But now I can do var dump p, And if I run that, you'll see now we have this class person, but these values, name and job, they've been set because we created this new instance. This function automatically ran. We set the name and job properties equal to what we passed in, and now we have this new class. So now I can do stuff like this, echo p communicate. We can give it commands, and because all people share the same characteristics, we know that they can communicate, and now we get communicating. If we want communicate to be more extensive, maybe we could have a style. What kind of communication style? And we could say communicating with, and then we will tack on style. And now if I run it, we'll get a stack trace error because style does not have a default. So we will say default is voice. There we go. Now we're communicating with the voice, but we can override that maybe with telepathy, one day maybe. And now we're communicating with telepathy, but they still share the same characteristics. Good. So I want you to pay attention to how we work with objects. P is our object, and to access properties within that object, we use this new syntax, and it looks like an arrow right there. So with arrays, we know that we use brackets. With objects, we use this arrow. But many times you want to be able to have the convenience of working with an object, but you don't actually want to create this blueprint or class. And in these cases, we can use what's known as a generic class, and that's called std class. So for example, if we were to take that same code before, person equals, it is a class, so we need to create a new instance of it, a new instance of this blueprint. If it helps, also think of houses. You have the blueprint for a house, but then you can have hundreds of houses with that same blueprint, but one house will be red, one will be green. Those are instances of that blueprint. That way, they're separate, but they all share the same structure. All right, so now we've created this new instance of the class. Now I can say person, and I can set properties on it, like first equals John, last equals Doe, and then job equals teacher. Now, if we var dump, what I want you to see here is that we're getting the same thing. Notice that std class, that is literally just an empty generic class that you can fill up. So notice we're getting the same thing. We have this public property. Public simply means it can be accessed from our instance. It's not limited to only that class. We've also set this last property, all these values. And just as before, I can echo person, job. There we go. We get teacher, first, and then a space, and then person last. We're getting the same thing, but now we're interacting with this information as an object rather than using an array. And a lot of people would say that's cleaner and more intuitive. One thing to be aware of, though, is that you can't add methods, at least not without a bit of trickery. So if we were to do person communicate equals function, and then we returned communicating, that's actually not going to work. And if I run that and we try to echo person communicate, we're going to get this error where it says called undefined method std class. So what's happening here is we're trying to add a method to this object, and that's not really the way it would work. In these cases where you need more flexibility, you would instead use your own class where you could define it, or there's also ways with the class name where you can take advantage of what we refer to as a magic method, such as public function call, which is something you can refer to, but right now it's way over our heads. We're not ready to dig into any of this stuff. For now, the only thing I want you to be aware of is that you can create a generic object by using the std class. All that is a generic empty class which you can fill up and use however you need. And the final thing is that we can cast an array to an object. So just as we have this, I'll comment this out, if we had person equals array, and once again we did first John, and last is Doe, we can actually cast that to an object. So watch, var dump person, there we go, we get this array. But now watch happens if I var dump, and now I'm going to cast this array to an object by preceding the variable name with object within parentheses. So it's just this syntax right here. We're going to cast that to an object. The same thing you could do if you had this value and you wanted to cast that to an integer, you could do it like that. So let's comment all this out, echo, and I forgot a semicolon. Let's add that on. There we go, 5. If we want to figure out what type, notice there's different types. We have strings, we have integers, we have arrays, we have objects. We can use this function getType. Run that, now we get integer, but if we did not have that, we would get string. And this will happen many times when people enter values into a form input. They're just entering the string 5, but that is not the same thing as the integer 5. So many times you'll want to cast that however you need. In this case, we'll cast it to an integer, and now we actually have the number 5 rather than the string 5. Anyhow, let's come back and I will uncomment these two. Now at the very top, we have this array, but the second one, we have this object. So now, if we had O equals object person, this one above, we can echo person first with that syntax. And the second one, we can echo O first with this syntax. John, John, and we're getting that same effect. All right, so this can be very confusing at first. If you have any questions at all, just jump over to the Tuts Plus forums, head down to Discuss Courses, and then at the bottom, find PHP Fundamentals, and go ahead and ask your question, and either myself or one of our staff tutors or one of your fellow students would be glad to dig in and help you understand it. All right, my name's Jeffrey Way, and I will see you in the next lesson.